Okay, so greetings, hello again. I'm talking in the aftermath of the murder of this man Jamal Kashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, a city that I know and love well. I've been to Istanbul. I attended the International Peace Research Association there a few years ago, met many Turkish peace scholars, peace researchers, and Turkey itself is a fascinating culture and country and poised in complex ways. The issues of intellectuals, intellectual freedom, etc. is very important in Turkey. So the fact that the killing happened there is disgraceful, and Turkey needs to be involved in as it is, in the inquiry into what happened. And you know, I was in touch with the Foreign Minister of Turkey before I went to the Peace Research Conference in Istanbul, and I went to Çanakkale, which is near Troy, and I visited the ruins of Troy. As a peace philosopher and poet, obviously I've read Homer. I'm mindful of this tragic war, the Trojan War, which was in many ways the beginning of the conflict between Europe and Asia. And I said prayers for peace there. I wrote a poem sitting on the ruins of Troy. And it was there that the Gallipoli landings happened as well. The British and Australians and New Zealanders thought it would be quite clever to try and invade Turkey. I personally lament World War I. At the World Intellectual Forum, we just had a meeting here, and we heard from a Scottish thinker, John Noble, who was saying that the evidence points to the fact that World War I was possibly deliberately engineered by financial forces in the City of London that wanted to destroy Germany as a power in Europe and to take down the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As a historian, I said, okay, so the research is going on here. I don't think there's enough absolute proof yet, but historians need to work in the archives on that. If it's true, it's absolutely, it's beyond scandalous. It's like, what? World War I, a deliberate conspiracy? Because the evidence is that the Kaiser wanted peace. He didn't want war. And so Turkey was also dragged into a war. So I think history is like watching a train crash in slow motion constantly, and you're, like watching it from above and unable to interrupt it, like in slow motion, like a dream when you can't prevent it. And I've watched several of these train crashes in my brief and short life. I was, alive when the Korean War was just coming to an end and the Vietnam War, and I remember when President Kennedy was shot. I was just a little boy, but I knew the seriousness of the situation. And then watching all the other wars in the Balkans, the Middle East unfold, and feeling one must try and stop them, which is why I set up Philosophers for Peace back in the 80s and Historians for Peace, and I've been campaigning ever since. But watching this current tragedy unfolding in the Middle East, as I've said, with this murder, I'm only able here now to join up the dots about Saudi Arabia's role in contemporary geopolitics. And I'm going to present some controversial, but I think probably provable in the long run, hypotheses that I would like intellectuals to seriously consider and work with me on finding the evidence or prove me wrong. But if it's true, then it is beyond scandalous. We're talking about a very evil series of events in history. Let me explain what I'm talking about. I'm writing a book about 9/11 at the moment, and I've come to the conclusion, as many other people have, but I think I'm the first trained and qualified academic historian to tackle the subject. No historians, none of my colleagues at the University of London, although they specialise in world history, nobody at SOAS, nobody at the School of History at the University of London, so far as I know, has yet done research onto 9/11. Nobody's done a PhD on it. I've checked, not at King's College, University College, not at my old college, SOAS and the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, which I find incredible because the events of 9/11 were foundational to the chaos we're facing in the world today. And it triggered the completely irrational invasion of Iraq by Blair and Bush. The one thing we know about 9/11 is it had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. And yet within a few months, the Western Blair and Bush were were cheering troops to invade Iraq, which was completely and utterly innocent of 9/11. So something very strange was happening, and I watched it like a train crash in slow motion in front of me as a historian. I called for peace, I called for negotiations, I went on the big demonstration march in London in February 2001, which was completely ignored by the establishment of Blair. And I think it's fairly obvious that we were lied to in the British Parliament, and the British people were lied to. Much later, Gordon Brown organised an inquiry called the Chilcott Inquiry, and Lord Chilcott is a historian. He was a colleague at the at the University of London School of Historical Sciences, where I was partly researching for my PhD at the time, right? I was doing a PhD on peace history at this time. And Chilcott chaired the inquiry, but it was the most incredible whitewash because he never asked the important questions. What happened during the entire Chilcott Inquiry, which cost tens of millions of pounds of British taxpayers' money, is they were only asking, could we have fought this war better? Were the troops badly armed? They were approaching the inquiry as if the righteousness of the war was granted and given. There was no kind of inquiry into was this the right war to be fighting? Why were we fighting? They never asked the bigger order questions. And although they had Tony Blair and all the other henchmen of the Blair government up on the witness stand, they were not under oath, and they were not asked the proper questions. So the whole thing was like a charade, a pageant, a pantomime, it seems to me. And what I'm calling for is a new inquiry. Because you see, the one question they never asked is, what's the link in your mind, Mr. Blair, between sending the British Army into war against Iraq in March 2003 and the tragic events that happened in America in September 2001? There's like an 18-month gap there. And if you look at the press and if you watch the television stuff, what happened during that 18 months was the propaganda blitz moved from, oh my God, we've been attacked. Within a day they were saying we've been attacked by Muslims. And within 2 days it was we've been attacked by Al-Qaeda. And then immediately it was we're going to get them. This was the rhetoric, no stone will rest unturned, we will get these people wherever they are. Now this was before any serious evidence came in. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was in the States, in New York State at the time, and who immediately, within 2 days, I'd rang her to see if she was alive, and she said, yes, we know it was Al-Qaeda. I said, do we? I mean, where's the evidence? I mean, isn't it a bit premature? How can you possibly know that? No, it's all over the news. Of course it's Al-Qaeda. And she almost challenged my integrity as if I was a traitor to even question it. In November that year, I organised a conference on the educational implications of 9/11 in St Dynel's Library, which was founded by Lord Gladstone, the Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister, who I greatly respect, one of the most intellectual Prime Ministers Britain has ever had, key figure in the Liberal Party, what's now the Liberal Democrat Party, and he left his library to the nation as a centre for educational research. He was a Christian, but he was also a philosopher, a classical scholar. He wrote books on Homer. He was a very wise and clever man. He was a friend of Schliemann, who discovered Troy's whereabouts in Turkey, actually. And when Schliemann came to London, Gladstone chaired the lectures. And he was a member of the Athenaeum, which is a sort of intellectual club in the centre of London. So I organised a conference there, and we got various speakers from all over Britain and a few from internationally. And we looked at 9/11 and we said, what are the educational implications of this? This is a catastrophe. And I was just training as a religious studies teacher at the time, so I was teaching RE classes in schools throughout Britain and Wales. And I was already teaching at the University of Oxford and London as well, sort of doing adult education. But at that point, it never occurred to us that the narrative might not be true. We all assumed that, yes, it was Al-Qaeda, it was the Muslims, because nobody could possibly consider that the whole thing could have been like a false flag thing. It was only a few years later, I organised an event and a speaker came from America, called Gail Scott, who'd done a lot of research on this stuff. And she was the first person I ever met who said, you know, Thomas, this 9/11 conspiracy thing, Al-Qaeda, is completely false. It's not the full story. And I said to her, what on earth are you talking about? You know, that can't be true. I mean, come on. We can't be being lied to by the entire presidential apparatus and prime ministerial apparatus of the UK and USA. I mean, come on. And she said, no, we are. And we had some interesting debates and discussions about it. But, and then later, you know, she went back to the States. And I then basically did my own research over a number of years. And I read loads of books about it. I studied it in great detail. And I tried to find out as much as I could about the facts. And like everybody else, you know, I watched the evidence on film and so on. And I gradually came to realise, no, there is something strange about this. The facts cannot be as they're said. And eventually, I determined to actually write a book about it. As a historian, simply suspending judgment, you know, I've been taught professionally how to write contemporary historical research, how to use sources, how to be critically weighing the different sources. And so I looked into it in great detail, and it's taken me 2 years to write this book. It's, as I say, it's the first academic historical study of 9/11 to come out. And it's going to be out within a few months. I'm just giving a preview here. There are about 10 hypotheses as to what caused the events of 9/11. The conventional Bush-Blair narrative is that it was Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden engineered the entire operation. They're the sole culprits, and that's it. And that was what was presented in the Bush Commission of Inquiry, which came out a few years later. Now, the architects and engineers, the scientific materials evidence, shows that version cannot be true. The buildings cannot have come down if it was simply two jets coming in at that angle in that capacity, and with that jet fuel. Jet fuel fires do not bring down steel-framed skyscrapers. It's never happened before in history, and it never will again. It's against all the laws of physics, and I'm a lover of physics. I love Newton. I've been to the house where Newton discovered the laws of gravity in Lincolnshire, and you know, as a historian, I have to respect physicists telling me this cannot be true. Well, then that makes me have to go back and say, well, okay, so that can't be true, that narrative, so there must be some other explanation. Well, one of the hypotheses that's come forward is that the buildings were pre-wired with a demolition charge, probably nanothermite, a military-grade explosive, which is super powerful and which could have brought the buildings down in the cataclysmic way we saw with these dust clouds. That's a hypothesis. It's one of 10 hypotheses that I explore in my book, which is the first time any scholar has ever gone into this subject in such detail. Then the question arises, well, okay, if that's true, and there is evidence that this is true, because they found nanothermite evidence trace in the dust that was discovered after, well then somebody must have pre-wired the building, right? Well, there are various hypotheses here. Somebody in American intelligence, a rogue unit, somebody with government approval, a foreign intelligence agency, possibly in league with an American intelligence agency. One hypothesis is that it was done deliberately to big up the event, that you know, the Al-Qaeda people, yes, they were doing their thing, but they were being monitored and watched from above, from a higher plane of intelligence. And so they timed it, having pre-wired the building, to collapse them when the planes came in. You know, I mean, it's an unbelievably sophisticated conspiracy, if that's true. And again, it's one of 10 or 12 hypotheses I explore. And there are possible culprits. I mean, I go through them all with a fine-tooth comb. You'll have to read the book, but foreign intelligence agencies might have been involved. They all had some kind of a motive, and there is some evidence for some of them being involved. And they include Israel, which the evidence shows, people like Chris Berlin have done a lot of research on this. They're convinced that, yes, it was Israel, it was Mossad, in order to try and create this sort of Islamic phobia against a hatred of Islam, which would suit Israel's foreign policy. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that it was, another one is actually that I've explored in the book is that it was China. And I don't want to kind of go into vast detail here, but let me just say that it seems to be a fact that Osama bin Laden, when he was living in Afghanistan in the run-up to the events of 9/11, was sent by the Taliban as a weapons buyer to Beijing 3 times. He was being tracked by Mossad. These seem to be facts. They're given in a book by Gordon Thomas, who was a historian of Mossad. It's a very, very important study. He's unfortunately dead now, and I can't interview him. I'm assuming his sources were accurate. He could have been fed lies, but as far as I know, he was telling the truth. And what he claims in his book, and he gives dates and references, is that Osama bin Laden was sent to China by the Taliban regime to establish treaties. And in return for some funding, the Chinese regime gave the Taliban regime a vast amount of weapons, like $10 billion worth of weapons. I can't remember the exact figure, but huge amounts of Chinese weapons, very powerful things. Because the Taliban, were afraid that, they might have to fight some, war in the future. And Osama bin Laden was the guy, the middleman, who went to Beijing to negotiate this. 3 times. Now, Mossad tracked these visits because Osama bin Laden was quite anti-Semitic. He was not, enamored with the Zionist project, to put it mildly. He was very pro-Palestinian. And then he succeeded. He brought all these weapons back to Afghanistan. And apparently, according to Gordon Thomas, when the Afghan army and the American invading force and so on finally attacked the caves at Tora Bora, where Osama bin Laden had been hiding out, his last stand, so to speak, they found the caves full of Chinese weapons. Now, these are facts that can be established historically. I'm assuming they're correct, but I suspend judgment on the veracity, but this is what I've read. Now, it follows logically that if that's true, if Osama bin Laden was in league with China to that extent, it's very possible that when he was in Beijing, he would have said to the Chinese, he would have had private discussions with them and said, look, you guys, we're about to hit New York, don't you? My team, Al-Qaeda, we've got this incredibly wonderful plot going. We're going to blow up the World Trade Center. Do you want to help? Because China, although it is ostensibly is an ally of the West, ostensibly an ally of, America, actually secretly is not. I mean, it's been playing, dragon diplomacy behind the scenes. Gordon Thomas actually wrote a book also about China's role. Ever since Tiananmen Square, the Chinese have been pretty ferocious game players in international geopolitics. And the hypothesis, therefore, that I explore in my history book, and I have to say I'm the first historian, apart from Gordon Thomas, who wasn't a historian, he's kind of journalist, to actually look at this, is that, yes, okay, so China had the money, it had the influence, and it would have had the agents to pre-wire those buildings. China's a fabulously wealthy country. It would have bought corrupt intelligence agents who could have easily pre-wired those buildings. Absolutely not a problem. Knowing full well that Osama bin Laden's team were about to come in. Why would China have done that? Because, it's the most incredible coup they would have had to bring down America and the West. And symbolically, they're destroying the World Trade Center. They're destroying the hub of capitalism, which in the minds of some Chinese Maoists is the devil incarnate. So they would have justified this in the names of, Maoist communist policy. Destroy your enemy and do it in secret. So it's another hypothesis, and I suspend judgment on all this. I find these things scary personally. I'm a simple, peace-loving person. The thought that China would have done that I find horrific and scary. I also explore the hypothesis that Blair and Bush discovered this. Within a few days they realised it was China. Their agents had worked it out. And they took a Machiavellian decision not to inform the world. because they knew it would be World War III. They said, if we go public with this, China's just blown up the World Trade Center and attacked the Pentagon, we'll have to declare war on China. We'll have to have a nuclear war. They will fight back. There'll be a nuclear exchange. Probably half of America and half of China will be destroyed within a week, and Europe. Russia will get involved. The Middle East will go up. It's probably going to be the end of humanity. And you know, Blair and Bush talked on the phone and said, it's not worth it. You know, we can't call them on this. We have to pretend we don't know. And we have to like divert the anger and sorrow that the Americans feel about this event. We'll go and attack somebody else. Oh look, let's go and attack Iraq. You know, they're a soft target. We blame them for everything. Propaganda, we can get that mill going. At least then we can have a kind of war that we know we can win. And it was a diversion. And Blair and Bush have lived with this on their conscience ever since, but they've thought, well, you know, we saved the world from World War III. It was a terrible, tough call, but we had to do it. I'm not saying that's true, I'm saying it's a hypothesis that I explore in my book. And I look at some of the evidence for and against this. Now there's another stream of evidence, which is that Saudi Arabia also had foreknowledge. That somehow, if the West had foreknowledge, if China had foreknowledge, also it's possible Saudi Arabia had foreknowledge. And there's huge amounts of evidence. I mean, most of the so-called 19 hijackers were actually Saudi citizens. Osama bin Laden was incredibly close to the Saudi establishment for years. He knew Khashoggi, who's just died. He was part of that intellectual elite that you know, that are active in Saudi intellectual life. And either a rogue unit within Saudi intelligence supported Osama bin Laden, knew Al-Qaeda were about to attack New York and said, okay, we'll help you by pre-wiring the buildings. Or, possibly, with official sanction. The trail would be covered up, you know, there'd be no letter from the king saying pre-wire the buildings. But, you know, it is weird that money was being transmitted from the embassy of Saudi Arabia under Prince Bandar, who was the ambassador to the USA at the time, paying off some of these Al-Qaeda agents, Mohammed Attar and co. We have money trails that the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C., prior to 9/11, was paying these Al-Qaeda agents. You know, like, how weird is that, right? Now, you can argue, well, they were double agents, weren't they? They were working for the Saudis, working for the CIA, and they were monitoring the bad guys. Probably not. They were probably the bad guys. And the Saudis knew, right? So we enter a very murky world. And it's this kind of murky world that leads me back to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. I think it's pretty certain that the Saudi embassy in Washington and the Saudi government in Riyadh had foreknowledge that 9/11 was coming. Possibly co-facilitated it in some way for their own crazy, God knows what kind of logic, because they're supposed to be allies of the US, right? I mean, I suspect that some of them thought, yeah, it's terrible what Al-Qaeda are doing, but hey, it's going to cause an awful lot of trouble. And, you know, the really good thing is we can then go and get Iraq. We can turn it around and go for Iraq now. You see, the Saudi monarchy hated Saddam Hussein because he was a kind of a socialist. He was a man of the streets, and Iraq had got rid of their monarchy. He was a Islamic socialist, and he wanted to lead the Arabic people into a new kind of post-monarchy setup. And the Saudis hated him for it. He was also a kind of secularist. I mean, within Islamic terms, he was a liberal. He allowed women to walk around the streets unveiled. He let them work and drive and be artists and poets and singers. He tolerated other religions. His prime minister was a Christian, Tariq Aziz. He had Baha'i friends. You know, the Iraq of Saddam Hussein was a sort of showcase in some ways of modern liberal Islamic socialist democracy, a kind of Yugoslavia Islamic style. And that really annoyed the very, very conservative Wahhabi Saudi regime, which is like light years behind that in terms of its ideology, which is anything that isn't Wahhabism, is a heresy and the devil. They seem to literally believe that, if you're not a Wahhabi, you literally are from the devil, because they believe literally in the devil, which is a huge problem for me as a Western philosopher. We outgrew our concepts of the devil, sometime during the Enlightenment, after having killed millions of witches, accusing them of being devils, devil worshippers. We realised actually this is a bad dream, it's time to wake up out of this nightmare. In Saudi Arabia, they haven't waken up out of that nightmare. They're still killing witches. Witchcraft is a death penalty in Saudi Arabia still. And there's a particular department that hunts witches. And apparently if you just pray in front of a candle, that makes you a witch. So, I'm obviously, Satan embodied according to the Saudi witch hunting people. But no, hey, I'm just a European, right? We had this thing called the Enlightenment. They haven't had it in Saudi Arabia. In Iraq, they had. This is the tragedy of modern history. We backed the wrong guy. If Saudi Arabia had foreknowledge and if it was involved in 9/11, then it's playing a pretty diabolic role behind the scenes in history. And therefore, this latest thing, the cutting up of an intellectual in the Saudi embassy in Turkey, is just like small change, really, compared to what they're getting away with in Yemen and in persecuting and attacking Shias wherever they find them. So what do? It's a tragic and complex situation. What I'm calling for is peace operations on all fronts. Okay, I'm a general of the peace movement. I coordinate philosophers of peace. One thing we need absolutely immediately is a historical commission into 9/11's history. And when my book's published in a couple of months, I'm going to be forming, under my institute's auspices, hopefully with the help of the UN, I will work at the most senior level I can, to organise an international historical commission into 9/11. It will be open for bona fide historians, like professors of history, heavyweights, from different countries involved and neutral, Iran, Israel, Palestine, America, US, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, all the Middle Eastern countries. I will be asking their most important historians to come forward and sit on the commission, and we will then go through the evidence. In my book I'm presenting, as I say, 10 hypotheses of what caused 9/11. I utterly suspend judgment. I'm going to be chairing this commission neutrally and professionally and as objectively as I possibly can. It will be, if you want, the real Chilcott Commission. The Chilcott Commission was a joke, as I say. It avoided all the questions. I can assure you I will not be avoiding the questions. It will be interesting to see which governments are prepared to open their archives to us, their historical archives of what was going on 9/11. I want to see the intelligence archives. I want to see the traffic that was going on in email and text and so on, in the American, in the Israeli, in the Saudi, in the British and Russian and Iraqi intelligence circles on the weeks leading up to 9/11 and the day and the weeks after. Now, if 99% of the world's nations say, yeah, fine, we want to join your commission, here's our 2 top historians, and by the way, yes, here's the archives, you can have a look, here's the passwords, and then 2 countries in the world say no, well, we're going to be drawing our own conclusions, aren't we? And I utterly suspend judgment as to how that will pan out. What I do think, however, and I'm just being honest, intellectually honest here, is that I think Saudi Arabia has got a lot of questions to answer about its foreknowledge of 9/11. And I think the American president knew that, which is why he censored even the pathetic report that he had commissioned from the National Commission of Inquiry. They even censored a whole section showing that Saudi Arabia was quite involved in the whole run-up to the events. Things like the fact that money was being paid from the Saudi embassy to Al-Qaeda agents. That was all. The American people and researchers like me didn't know that for 10 years because it was kept under lock and key. You were not allowed to read that. It was only Obama that finally opened that document, which was an appendix to the official report. What else are they sitting on? What other information has not been put in? Well, I can assure you we will be finding out. Now, I lament the death of Khashoggi, not least because he would have been a brilliant witness on the 9/11 business. He knew bin Laden closely, and he was as shocked as anyone else when the events went down on that day. I would have loved to interview him for the 9/11 Historical Commission. I think, and I mean it's a speculation, I wonder if Khashoggi had begun to realise that the official let's blame Saudi Arabia, let's blame Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda for 9/11 was actually not the whole truth. Maybe he'd begun to realise, join up the dots, and that maybe somebody in the Saudi regime had foreknowledge and had pre-planned the higher level operation. Yes, Osama bin Laden probably did authorise a team to attack it, but probably didn't think it would, be pulled off, or didn't take it too seriously. After all, he's one guy in a cave in Afghanistan with a bunch of people. Maybe the Saudi regime was involved in the higher level operation, and maybe Khashoggi had discovered this. And maybe that's part of why the Saudis have now slaughtered him so mercilessly. I mean, I'm just hypothesizing here. But there will be other people who can come forward as witnesses in Saudi Arabia, and I'm appealing to them now to clear this up, to get peace in the Middle East. We have to have truth. That's why I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. Without truth, there can be no reconciliation. Without truth between the followers of Aisha and the followers of Ali, there can be no peace. Without truth between the followers of Muhammad and the followers of Jesus and the followers of Moses, there can be no truth. And if you say to me, yes, but truth is specific to us, we, the followers of Moses, have all the truth, or we, the followers of Muhammad, have all the truth, or we, the followers of Jesus, have all the truth, I would urge you to study philosophy, because philosophy teaches that no discrete particular revelatory system has all the truth. They're all parts of the truth, and they reflect aspects of the truth. But the true truth is like the philosophers' higher picture, higher wisdom experience, which Plato and Aristotle and Ibn Sina and Maimonides and Ibn Rushd and all the greatest thinkers of history have talked about, and Hegel and so on. And that's where I'm coming from. That's the call to the TRC for the Middle East. How does this impact in Britain? I just want to join up a couple of more dots for people, because Britain is so in bed with Saudi Arabia that I actually suspect Saudi Arabia's money is partly responsible for Brexit. I'm so opposed to Brexit. It's such an irrational and stupid policy that I've been watching very carefully in the media and the press ever since that referendum and the implications were known. And there are several dots we can join up. Firstly, the European Parliament was about to pass a law outlawing weapons sales to Saudi Arabia or other regimes that commit human rights abuses. The European Union as a whole, including Britain, was going to be banned from selling weapons to regimes like Saudi Arabia. And in the very week that the referendum took place, I was living in Scotland at the time, that bill was going through Parliament and is being accepted in European countries, France, Germany, etc. We can no longer sell to extreme human rights abusing regimes. Now, I think that's absolutely right. We shouldn't be selling to countries that are torturing and murdering and bombing and gassing their populations or their neighbouring populations. But Britain has, in its arms industry, has a vested interest in selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, as does the USA. And I think that there was a USA/UK/Saudi policy decision around that time to back the independence referendum and to bring in Brexit at the highest possible level. I think it was done behind the scenes, and a huge amount of money was thrown at it, Saudi money. And it was felt that this was in the policy